Today I'd like to speak on some passages in 1 Timothy chapter 5 that are often used to support the idea that Bible teachers, whether on YouTube or in church, are entitled to some kind of financial reimbursement for their instruction. I would tend to disagree with such an idea, and what I'd like to do now is explain what I believe is a more sound understanding and application of these passages. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17 through 18, we read, "Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, 'You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain,' and the laborer deserves his wages." First of all, the word honor in this passage is the Greek word time, which has two meanings. It can mean value, or it can mean refer to the honor or respect that one deserves because of rank. Or there are those who seem to think this word actually means salary or wages. The fact is, this word time never means salary or wage in the New Testament. This word is used about 28 times, and it seems to refer to honor, and the other 8 times it is used in the New Testament seems to refer to value. Also, significantly, this Greek word time is used 4 other times in 1 Timothy, and in each context, the word clearly does not refer to money or salary at all, but instead refers to respect, reverence, or value. For example, in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 1, Paul says, "Let as many servants as are under the yoke count their own masters worthy of all honor, that the name of God and his doctrine be not blasphemed." If honor means salary or money in this passage, that would seem to imply this passage is teaching that Christians are to give their masters money or all kinds of money, which doesn't really make much sense. In addition, note that in 1 Timothy 5, verse 3, Christians are commanded to honor widows who are really in need. This doesn't mean that they're to pay widows a wage or salary, but only that they are to seek to value and respect them. Of course, this value and respect may include serving them and ministering to them in various ways and even donating money to them if they need it. The reason is because back then, if a woman was a widow with no living relatives to support her, she might not have the ability to sustain herself. That is why the church is responsible to maintain them. But this idea of maintaining widows in such cases would not apply to elders, because elsewhere in the New Testament, elders are called to earn a living and support themselves. Consider that in Acts chapter 20, verse 33 through 35, Paul basically tells the elders of Ephesus to work with their own hands to support themselves. As he says, "I coveted no one's silver or gold or apparel. You yourselves know that these hands ministered to my necessities and those who are with me. In all things I have shown you that by working hard in this way we must help the weak and remember the words of the Lord Yeshua, how he himself said, 'It is more blessed to give than to receive.'" In other words, Paul is saying that he didn't take money from the church of Ephesus in order to support himself. Instead, he worked with his own hands to meet his own needs. And so would the elders of Ephesus, to work with their own hands, to have a regular job, to both sustain themselves and others who are weak, that is, people who are not able to take care of themselves. And remember that these elders were of the church of Ephesus. And this is very significant in regard to understanding the proper meaning of 1 Timothy 5, verse 17. Because when Paul wrote 1 Timothy, Timothy was stationed in Ephesus. So would it make any sense at all that while Paul told the Ephesian elders to support themselves in Acts 20, he would then go on to tell Timothy in 1 Timothy that these same elders are entitled to receive a wage or a salary from the church? In my mind, that is highly unlikely. So again, a widow was entitled to be supported when her situation was a desperate one, where she was not able to sustain herself. But such support would not apply to able-bodied elders who are to follow Paul's example and sustain themselves with a regular job. It's pretty clear by simply looking at the meaning of and use of the word time or honor that Paul does not have a wage or salary in view in 1 Timothy 5:17. Paul wanted to convey the idea of a wage in this passage. He could easily use the Greek word for wages, misthos, but he does not. In addition, some think Paul is speaking about salary in verse 17 because of the 2 illustrations Paul cites in verse 18 as we read. "For the scripture says, 'You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain,' and the laborer deserves his wages." What Paul appears to be doing is giving examples of how animals and people receive something in exchange for their work. He does this in order to show how elders are to receive something for their work as well. In other words, even as an ox is to receive something, namely corn, for its work, And the laborer is to receive something, a wage, for his work. So the elder is to receive something for his work, honor and respect. We are to give honor to elders because they are older and generally more experienced and wiser in the faith. And we are to give double honor to elders for their work in regard to ruling and teaching. But again, Paul is not dealing with the issue of financial reimbursement, but with the issue of value and honor that is due to the elder, especially during an instance of accusation or discipline, which seems to be implied in verse 19. As Paul says, against an elder, receive not an accusation, but before 2 or 3 witnesses. In other words, Christians are to honor their elders in such cases by being very cautious before accusing them of any sin, and not readily believing any evil report about them, as this text seems to imply. Another possibility of what Paul is referring to by using these illustrations is the hospitality that is due to traveling gospel workers. But Paul uses the expression, the laborer deserves his wages, which is very similar to the expression Christ uses in Luke chapter 10, verse 7, where he is telling his disciples that they are worthy, what they are worthy of in light of their work as traveling ministers of the gospel. As we read, and in the same house remain, eating and drinking such things as they give. For the laborer is worthy of his hire. Go not from house to house. It is clear that Yeshua is not teaching his disciples that they are to receive money for their work. Instead, his point is simply that his disciples are entitled to have their basic physical needs met by those they minister to in their travels. In other words, food and drink were to be given to his disciples for their work, even as a wage is to be given to a laborer for his work. So likewise, what Paul may have in view in 1 Timothy 5:17 through 18, the elders are entitled to hospitality whenever they are traveling about engaging in their work of overseeing and teaching. In further support of the fact that 1 Timothy 5:17 merely refers to giving respect or honor to elders because of their labors, consider Paul's words in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 12 to 13. As he says, we ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Be at peace among yourselves. And the Greek word for respect is similar to the Greek word for honor in 1 Timothy 5:17. It carries the idea of having regard for someone and cherishing someone, paying attention to someone. So we see that similar to what Paul says in 1 Timothy 5:17. Paul is exhorting Christians to value and have regard for their elders because of their work. And note there's no mention of paying the elders money in exchange for their labors at all. What we owe the elders instead is to value and cherish them. In order to further emphasize my point, allow me to give another example of Paul's use of the word honor. Consider Ephesians chapter 6, verse 2, where Paul calls children to honor their parents. As he says, honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. Similar to the passage in 1 Timothy 5, Paul uses the word honor or time in regard to how a child or even adults are to honor their parents. Of course, I don't think anyone would insist that Paul is suggesting that Christians should pay their parents a wage. However, one could use the same arguments that some use to justify paying a pastor a salary in regard to why Christians should give their parents a salary. Some Christians argue that because pastors work really hard, that we need to pay them. Although parents spend much love and expend much love and effort and time and energy into raising their children, shouldn't they be compensated for their labors? In fact, as I think most parents would agree, I believe that being a parent, especially a mother with all of her responsibilities, involves more labor than being a pastor with his New Testament responsibilities. In light of this, should we conclude that what Paul has in mind in Ephesians 6, verse 2, is that if a Christian is able, they should make a point of compensating their parents for all their work by giving them a regular wage? Well, I don't think so. Or although Paul does not have a salary in mind when he uses the word honor or time, the concept of supporting parents financially at times can be entailed by the command to honor one's parents. If the parents are stricken with poverty and are unable to support themselves, the children are to seek to support them. 1 Timothy 5, verse 4 alludes to this. As we read, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. Generally, back then, if a woman was a widow, she was not in the position to support herself. And so she was very dependent on her family to be sustained if she was needy. However, obviously, if the widow was a millionaire or had a good job, I don't think Paul is expecting the family of the church to give her money. So it is with parents in regard to how we can honor them. One of the ways we can honor our parents is by supporting them financially when they are unable to support themselves in certain situations. Likewise, while in 1 Timothy 5:17, salary is not in view when Paul uses the word honor, financial support can be in view at times, namely when the elder is maybe stricken with poverty as a result of certain providences in his life. This was actually the practice of the early church, as the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia states when it addresses the fact that elders did not receive salaries or payment for their work. The ministry of the early church received no stipends. They were at the same time merchants, artisans, or engaged in other secular callings and supported themselves. If office bearers received a share, it was only on account of their poverty and because they were on the roll of the widows, orphans, and helpless poor. Also, in further support of the fact that New Testament elders worked secular trades to support themselves, consider the words of Robert Baker. These leaders usually worked to earn a living and were not supported by the church. Now note that although it's perfectly fine to donate money to a needy elder because your Christian values and respects him, that is not the same as paying them a salary or a wage in exchange for their work. It is different because then the relationship of the elder to the church is that of a hireling, something that Christ does not want. Having a paid elder creates a clergy laity system which is not biblical at all. All believers are priests of God and are to engage in edifying the body, not just some special class of believers like pastors or elders we see today who regularly dominate church meetings with their extensive orations and so forth. Also consider a quote from Philip Schaff where he helps explain the origin of salaried ministers, and it's clearly not the result of a sound exposition and application of New Testament principles. Instead, it was due to an unbiblical exaltation of the clergy. As he says, with the exaltation of the clergy, late in the 3rd century, appeared the tendency to separate them from secular business and even from social relations. They drew their support from the church treasury, which was supplied by voluntary contributions in weekly collections on the Lord's Day. After the 3rd century, they were forbidden to engage in any secular business or even to accept any trusteeship. So we see that it was unbiblical church tradition that helped give rise to the concept of salaried clergy. Furthermore, consider 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 14, which seems to emphasize how it is generally more appropriate for elders to support churches rather than churches to support the elders. As Paul says here, for the 3rd time, I'm ready to come to you, and I will not be a burden, for I seek not what is yours but you. And Paul is emphasizing that he wasn't after getting money or support from them. Instead, what he was after was their hearts and their spiritual well-being. But note the reason he gives for not wanting their money or possessions. He says, for children are not obligated to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. In other words, Paul seems to be implying that if anyone in the church family of Christ is going to be giving money to others, it shouldn't be so much younger Christians saving up to support the elders, but the elders saving up to support younger Christians. And consider what Paul goes on to say in verse 15. I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? This text is my response to Bible teachers and elders who might insist that they work so hard in their studies and teaching, and surely it is appropriate for them to get payment for it. That certainly didn't seem to be the attitude of Paul. For as he says in the text, he had joy spending himself for the souls of the Corinthians. The word spend carries the idea of exhausting and using up something. Paul is referring to how he gladly exhausted himself, using up so much of his time, energy, heart, mind, and soul, burning it all up as a sacrifice to Yahweh as he served these Corinthians for the benefit of their souls. And this should be the attitude of every Bible teacher in your church, as well as on YouTube, where they have a gladness in spending and exhausting themselves to profit your souls, not in hopes of making money off of you, or getting a love offering or a donation or support for their ministry. In summary, the thrust of 1 Timothy 5:17 is in regard to the honor and value and respect, possibly hospitality that is due to elders because of their work. The idea that the text supports Bible teachers charging money for their instruction and labors cannot clearly be derived from the passages at all. It does not harmonize with everything else the New Testament teaches about the need to use spiritual gifts sacrificially out of love for others. Remember that Paul's view of the church was that of a family. Consider that in an earthly family, you often have elders such as fathers and grandfathers who may give guidance and advice to the younger. And they should do it out of love for them, not in hopes of getting money or payment for their labors. What good father or grandfather would do that? Likewise, in the family of Christ, the elders are to give guidance and instruction to the younger out of love for them, not in hope of getting paid back for their work. The only treasure Bible teachers should be seeking to get for their labors are the rewards that Yeshua will give to his faithful servants when they stand before him.